of the changes prompted by addressing the COVID-19 situation and in this country, issues of racial injustice and much more. So I don't have a formal talk, but I did try to prepare some remarks responsive to Damian's request. So let me start first of all by telling you how fortunate you are to have Damian as your instructor. I knew him when he was I can say with pride, I knew him when he was a student. Yes, I see people doing thumbs up. He was a wonderful student, an inspiring student, beloved by his teachers and his colleagues in the doctoral program. And it's just so nice to reconnect with him and Eva. His love of learning and his expansive intellectual breadth was evident even back in the days when he was a doctoral student. So you really are fortunate to have him as a colleague and instructor. So Damian had asked me to speak about doctoral studies in law. And again, as I mentioned, things have been hectic, not only for the reasons I've just mentioned, but in addition, because of the quirks of the way in which we do doctoral admissions here. We spent a good part of this week, I've totally lost track of time, actually doing our doctoral admissions, which we only do at the end of the LLM year. And so that's conducted under a very tight timetable. And I can say something about the substantive dimensions of that if it's of interest to people. Very briefly, these are very extensive, elaborate, and collegial discussions among a large group of faculty, typically somewhere between 7 and 10. Principally anchored around the type of project that students would do if they were able to be a part of the doctoral program. So they're actually not administrative or technical, but one of the more intellectually substantive undertakings. But anyway, let me say a little bit about doctoral programs in law in this country. And please, at any point, feel free to raise questions, take issue, push back. No need to wait till the end. Although at the end, what will not be a long presentation, I'm delighted to stay and take questions or have debate. So in this country, things are somewhat different than many other countries in terms of doctoral studies in law. As you all know, law is not itself an undergraduate field of study or major or concentration in the United States. A few undergraduate institutions have law, but certainly when I was a student at the University of Cambridge and read law, the first degree I did was with other students who had come straight from a secondary school. And so it's quite different in the US. Everybody has done something else prior to their first law degree. And in part, what that means is law school is an odd blend of being both academic and practical in its focus. And that in turn means that historically, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, that one has not always needed a doctorate to be appointed to a law faculty. So I know that's quite different than universities in many, many countries. I mean, it's hard to conceive in Germany or in Japan that one would secure appointment at a top law faculty without having done a doctorate or something equivalent to it. I'd like to think of that in US law schools, we simultaneously serve three functions. One is to teach the students about the law, and one is to teach the students to, within the existing framework of how our society or other societies are organized, to imagine ways to make the law better, change the law. And the third is we are one of the places, not the only, in a university in which people can radically reimagine what law and justice might involve. So it's sort of simultaneously carrying out three functions. So anyway, to our doctoral program here and at comparable US universities. So Harvard and Columbia were among the first, the very first to initiate doctoral studies in law in the United States. And at Harvard, it was approximately 108 years ago that we launched the doctoral program. And it's gone, one might say, historically through several phases, and I'll quickly describe those. So the first phase, um, which lasted at least through World War II, was one that was largely US focused in terms of most of the students being from the US and working on um, dissertations that were predominantly focused around US law, and that were predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly doctrinal in their nature. And dissertations tended to be rather short and not involve a great deal of coursework. Often being US focused, who were the students in these? Well, they tended to be two groups, very broadly speaking. One were people who had graduated from, for example, leading state university law schools. These are examples, not exclusively, and been at the top of their class, and then wanted to come to a place like Harvard or Columbia or Yale to show that at the sort of highest level of competition, they were extremely competitive to secure teaching appointments. And the second group was that of individuals, irrespective of what their prior legal education was, who had a more focused subject or set of intellectual interests and could be fully satisfied in what was then called the LLB, the basic law degree, 3-year law degree. There were certainly international students even in this early phase, but it was more heavily drawn from US students. The second phase really is in the aftermath of World War II, and it was a period of probably 50 years or so, in which the focus changed some. The programs became much more international in their reach and student body, the doctoral programs. Projects still tended to be fairly focused, somewhat, but not exclusively doctrinal, often because of the broader range of students tended to be comparative. People are writing about the law in their home country or comparing that to the law in the US or other countries, or international, not exclusively, but often were. Aspirations of participants were to, in many cases, enter the academy, but not necessarily. Many people in this 50-year or so period aspired to go into international organizations or go to their home country and become legal advisors to foreign ministries or enter practice at a high end. And from our school, there were quite a few people who became very distinguished. Ma Ying-jeou, who was the president in Taiwan, Navi Pillay, who was a justice of the Constitutional Court of South Africa and UN Human Rights Commissioner, Ibrahim Shehata, who was the World Bank legal vice president, general counsel, and so forth. In the third phase, which is where we still are, it's changed yet again. And so, at least in the U.S., and speaking here only of the U.S., I don't mean it boastfully, but I think our law school took the lead in transforming the SJD. One of the professors with whom Damian studied, David Kennedy, deserves a lot of the credit for initiating this. And the idea was to make the doctoral degree in law more akin to a serious Ph.D. in a top arts and sciences faculty. And so that had several implications. One was that the work on which students were engaged became more conceptual and more theoretical and less anchored to legal doctrine as such. And we certainly these days do graduate some students who've not engaged a great deal in their dissertations with legal doctrine. Indeed, sometimes that's a criticism of US legal education in general in the area of international law, that Americans the United States government might respect international law more if there were more extensive training in the doctrine of international law. Anyway, so in this third period, the work product of students becomes more conceptual, and we built in more of the features. This I've done building off of a model that I think Professor Kennedy deserves credit for initiating and making it more akin to a doctorate in the arts and sciences in the following kinds of ways. So each student has to do multiple fields, and therefore works not only with a single faculty advisor, had typically been the case in our second phase that I described before. Now people work with at least three or four professors. In having multiple fields, we also have general oral exams before the student can go to the dissertation writing stage. So that is a fairly new thing that had not existed before. Our definitions, at least at Harvard, of fields, both for working with faculty and for exam purposes, is probably a good bit more fluid than in many arts and sciences departments. So when I was a doctoral student as I was in history at Yale a long time ago, in one's field, one typically got a reading list with the canons of whatever it was, American diplomatic history, medieval church history. There was a canon of books one should read. In our current doctoral program, there's a good bit more plasticity, where students and faculty together can work out what they think a field constitutes, and not necessarily be limited to a particular enshrined canon of readings. And that has strengths and weaknesses. It provides for more choice and specificity and taking account of change. On the other hand, it's a little harder to sort of say somebody has mastered a particular set area. It probably it fosters more interdisciplinarity, which has been a big feature of our doctoral program. I might say one other sort of positive attribute of this, which is, as my colleague Roberto Mangabeira Unger, who's the Brazilian political philosopher, has said, within the US Academy, law schools surprisingly are among the most intellectually diverse parts of the university. Why is that? Well, in the US, at least in political science departments, quantitative work has really captured many of the political science or government departments at leading universities. And so if you're not doing quantitative work, it's hard to get appointment. In literature departments, it's obviously quite different. So postmodern literary criticism seems to dominate in many. In law schools like our own, there's just a plethora of different approaches. And so we have people who are highly quantitative. We have economists who are building models. We have people very influenced by critical legal theory and sort of postmodern approaches to reading legal texts. We have people like myself who are sort of historians. We have just a really broad range, and that is connected to what I said about fields, because we have less orthodoxy. We have room for faculty and students to craft what, given their methodological and other approaches, seems right. We also have in our current doctorate requiring students to do at least 2 presentations to the whole doctoral community. Damien can tell you about these. One early after their generals to present their work is still at an early stage and could be amenable to significant change. So reaching out to the community for sort of exposing one's ideas at again, a formative point. And then one close to the end where a student in effect presents a part of the dissertation or something that would be a paper or a job talk. That's independent of defending one's dissertation, independent of a prose seminar that we have on methodology and the like. The composition of our doctoral program still remains predominantly, and it's an interesting phenomenon. We do have some really terrific US students, but hiring patterns in US law schools have changed a good deal, and I can talk about that briefly in a minute. But for or the strongest U.S. law students in the JD programs at top U.S. law schools, often a career path will be to be at the top of their class and then do a clerkship for.
There's a bit of background noise, and I don't know where it's coming from. Could everyone just please mute themselves? Thanks so much.
What's that?
Please continue, Professor Alford. There was just some background noise. So.
Sorry. Yeah. So hiring in American law schools these days to faculty positions would largely go along 2 or 3 lines. So one line would be a type of people I've just described who don't have a doctoral degree, but have been stellar JD students and done clerkships with, for example, the U.S. Supreme Court, very less than the top 1%, a very fraction of the top 1% of the best students get to do that. And then will have written something, but not necessarily a great deal, perhaps a couple of articles before they go on the job circuit. A second category would be people who have serious PhDs or the law doctorate, and several of our SJDs at Harvard end up getting extremely good teaching jobs in the US or elsewhere. So in that category, there's several economists, philosophers, historians, and others. And the third category would be clinicians, people who've done less writing but have really rich and extensive practical experience. So again, just to conclude that point, mostly international students writing highly theoretical work, some competing on the US job market, some never having any interest in that and wishing to return to their home country or third countries. Final thing I'd like to talk about, and I'm glad to take any kind of questions, would be just briefly to say a few things about COVID-19 and what all this means. I mean, what a horrific tragedy for the entire human race. There's a wonderful historian of science at Harvard named David S. Jones, both a PhD and MD, who writes that long before this epidemic, the epidemics strip bare what a society is about. They take away the veneer and pomposity of ways that societies use to explain themselves, and they reveal the flaws and seams in a society's structure, and they sadly reveal what its deepest values are about. So assuming that to be the case, it's played out pretty tragically in this country. I don't need to tell you about that. It's really of a piece with what we've been seeing about racial justice in this country as well. For the university, it's just presented all kinds of difficult challenges. We've made the decision at our law school that, how to put it, that we will be online in the fall, but more importantly, we will try to remediate some of the ways that this or any other change plays out unequally to different groups of students, different groups of citizens, and I can say more about that later. But it's really been extraordinarily difficult in all types of ways. Going back to doctoral students to conclude, in some respects, there's more solitude. So I've had some doctoral students, even as recently as yesterday, say to me, ironically, they've gotten a lot more work done in the last 3 months, and so they appreciate the horror of all this, but at a personal level have found it to help their work. But I still think for the kind of informal interactions of students learning from each other, challenging each other, meeting with faculty informally, clearly Zoom is not a good and complete substitute. I know when I was teaching last semester, students were incredibly patient. I couldn't believe it, frankly, how seriously they took it. But I found it much harder to spark debate between students. You know, they'd listen to me, but I was more interested after a while in having them debate certain issues amongst themselves, and they were more willing to do that when we met face to face earlier in the semester than they were on Zoom, and perhaps it's not a surprise. Anyway, let me stop there. I'd love to take any kind of question. You know, feel free to ask anything. I'd be delighted to take any kind of questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Alford. I'm sure all of us have so many questions to ask you. Thank you for this fantastic presentation, also for your kind words, I have to say. But so you mentioned earlier, do you remember in 2013, we had an SJD conference. There was the 80th anniversary of the PhD SJD program at Harvard Law School. And I remember back then, Roberto Unger, whom you mentioned actually, discuss the difference between an SJD and a PhD in, in a different, let's say in history or economics, combined with the JD, which seems to be, trendy nowadays. And I remember he said that he was actually not so fond of it. He said that all this multidisciplinarity is going in the wrong direction, that no one is doing then law anymore, or people don't understand law properly if they're more focusing on economics. So what do you think about that? So where is this moving, this interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity? Is this going in the right direction, you think, in the United States and elsewhere? And also connected with this, would you say, or how you would say that law and PhD in law and how we lawyers are uniquely positioned among the sciences to describe the world, to investigate the world, and to come up with new ways of dealing with injustice? And
So I think if you go back in the history of almost any great civilization, you see ultimately discussion about the importance of all things in good measure, of balance, of Chinese called zhongyong, kind of a finding the right tipping point balance, ancient Greeks. So I think, here we're obviously talking about vast swaths of time in the last century of legal education. I think there was there has been at multiple points in U.S. legal history reaction against formalism. That too excessively formal an approach to law leads one to not understand the sort of political, economic, sociological, demographic, intellectual, other underpinnings that produces whatever the doctrine, the formal law is, formal rule is. And so, legal realism would be one of the principal ways that was attacked. Like all things, I think, initially that was probably, just my preferences, probably very a good corrective, but then sometimes things maybe go too far and people get so engaged in the underlying political economy of a set of rules that they maybe don't cultivate the skills of the sort of fine analytical doctrinal skills of a lawyer as much as they might. Think of it, it's very similar in literature and literary studies. We look at a text, we look at a sonnet by Shakespeare in utter isolation from the times in which Shakespeare lived, or do we as well look at that context and what's the right balance? We talk about this actually a fair amount. Even in our voting on our last set of, we have our little graduate committee I've mentioned before, our last set of degrees awarded this year. One of my colleagues said, well, there's not a lot of law in this particular dissertation. And then another wonderful colleague got quite, it's a very genial process, very collegial, but he thought that was not a good question, that we had to be very mindful of, in fact, intellectual freedom of other faculty supervisors as long as the quality was very high. So I don't think there's a single right resting point. And I actually like the fact that, I'm sure this is true of any US law faculty, that there's a variety of approaches. So that would be my quick answer, but I can see where Roberto's coming from. I do think in the international law field, it might not be a bad thing in the US to have a little more focus, on doctrine. And that's partly international lawyers in the US feeling often on the defensive with their colleagues in law schools who are judging them or hiring new faculty having a skepticism about international law, and it's maybe partly that I tend to think in large powers, whatever, U.S., China, Russia. Maybe there isn't quite as much attention to international legal doctrine as in other countries. But anyway, that's whole other story.
Thank you. So just to say, Ms. Anna Cipriano just joined us, our Vice Chancellor, to say hello as well.
Hello.
And Professor William Schabas, I know, has to leave relatively early. So I'll, if you have any questions, please go ahead. And Professor Alford, I have tons of questions still for you. So, and I'm sure others have as well, but I don't want to monopolize the debate. So please go ahead.
Sure. Professor Schabas, thank you for coming.
There, I'm muted. You must go by Bill, don't you?
Yes, I do.
Like me, okay. Thank you for doing this with us. I have a question about the JSD at Harvard, and I guess in other American universities. Do you take in students who don't have previous law, like earlier law degrees, whether it's a primary degree? I'm calling the JD a primary degree because it's really like what we give here, although I know you consider it a postgraduate degree, or a master's in law, or can they come right in, can they parachute into a doctoral level studies in law without having previous legal, a law degree as such?
Thank you. So I agree with you. The JD really, although we call it it's odd. You know, it is a primary degree in law. It really is the first degree in law, but it's done by people who've done another course, another subject first, and so it's sort of a hybrid. You know, it really is basic, fundamental, as if it were a new language. The students are a little older, more mature. U.S. law, in fact, U.S. law schools increasingly are trying to take students with work experience or further study beyond the basic undergraduate degree. But you're right. I think in our case, and I think it's probably true of all the other U.S. law schools, there would be an expectation to have done at least a prior degree in law. And I would say probably most of our doctoral students have done two. So if they're international students, they've often done a degree at home or in a third country, and then come to us for their LLM, a one-year degree. And so they're quite richly experienced intellectually in law. I don't think we've, in recent memory, taken anybody with no prior legal education. And I think that would be true for the other U.S. law schools, probably all of them, the doctoral program, certainly the stronger schools.
But they see themselves as academic. So they see themselves as academic lawyers, really, at the doctoral level.
Right. So I think before the changes of the last 25 years, there were in the program several who did not aspire to an academic career. They were very smart, but they wanted to enter foreign ministries or advise international organizations, occasionally private practice. Now there are very few students with those aspirations. There's still a few, but I would say almost all want to be academics, because it would be hard to spend 5 or so years writing a doctorate, doing a doctoral program in law, writing a highly conceptual paper, if one's aspirations were not to want to continue to do that. It's a hard undertaking to write a doctorate in law. You know, your biggest task is to really sit alone and imagine something that nobody in the world has imagined before. So hard if you want to be out there changing the world immediately through action as opposed to through ideas.
Thanks.
Right, wonderful. So may I just ask one more? Oh, no, Alice, please go ahead, please.
Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Alford. Actually, my question follows on directly from what you have just said, in a way, about the preoccupation with I suppose, longer term, conceptual, more universal questions, which you're now doing in a context under the Trump presidency of the most dire and urgent threat to democracy and the rule of law, clearly, and the prospect of 4 more years of that even more so. So I suppose my question in a way is, how far in the past 3.5 years have you felt your faculty feeling an imperative, if you like, to respond to that threat? Or how much has it sort of started to monopolize the intellectual life or the day-to-day discussions and so on? Or how much have you been able to kind of pursue those longer term interests, which are in some, well, they're not unrelated, but in some ways independent of this hopefully transitory threat? So it's a slightly vague question, but yeah, how have you felt the need, if any, to respond to the Trump presidency, I suppose, is the question.
So thank you, Professor Donald. So your question is indeed a very apt one, and it is the prospect back in 2015-16 of a Trump presidency, and certainly the tenure so far has been a topic, as you might imagine, of constant discussion among faculty. You know, there's no institutional position as such. Institutional statements in the last couple of weeks about issues of racial justice, but not about the Trump presidency in a direct way. But individual faculty or groups of faculty clearly have been engaged in a variety of ways. And so I think it certainly it impacts what people teach and how they teach it and the classroom discussion. I teach something, I will be teaching something this coming semester called the Comparative Law Workshop, in which we look at comparative law. We talk about some of its most fundamental issues. We have papers in progress by leading scholars, and the students' job is to critique those. And so this year, I think in a lot of comparative law teaching and writing, there's kind of an assumption of a kind of progressive dimension to comparative law, where you look to what other jurisdictions have done to learn to build a better and more just society, or at least in a neutral way, develop more efficient rules. I'd like this time in doing it with a colleague with whom I teach to have it focus as well on less attractive uses of comparative law, how one authoritarian society borrows from another authoritarian society. And our focus in this is, this coming year, is China and Islamic law, Chinese law and Islamic law. She is an American, African-American Muslim, my co-teacher, who I've taught several times. And so we decided that we haven't quite figured out how to label it and frame it, but that we would be looking at issues of authoritarianism in law and comparative law, including societies that in some ways may be bleeding toward leading in that direction, including our own. So in other words, not to exempt explorations in comparative law that are not always in the spirit of liberalizing. You know, I think it's had the Trump presidency profound impact, and I think this coming year you'll probably see in American law schools more public-facing efforts to. Here I'm speaking just very personally as an individual, not as a vice dean or anything of that sort. I think public is looking for understanding, education to different institutions, to whether it's leading newspapers or universities or churches, how in this time of crisis about racial justice, this time of crisis about the Constitution, you know, how do we think about this? How do we understand it? So I don't see our role as propagandizing, but I do see it as you know, being honest about the challenges we face. Now, having said that, I think there's a lot of difference among individual faculty about what that then means in a classroom. So one of my colleagues has said, well, you know, we've had faculty workshops about such things. One colleague has said, well, we still have to be extremely respectful of students who don't share that view of President Trump, so that they don't feel intimidated and silenced, and that there's only one correct view. And I've had another colleague a dear friend, who's a great professor of constitutional law, say, I couldn't honestly teach about the Constitution without saying what I believe about the present administration's very destructive practices. And so I will, on day one, say to the students, here is what they probably already know, he's quite famous, but here's what I think, and here's what's likely to be part of the conversation this semester. And if that's uncomfortable for you, you don't have to take my class or 6 other constitutional law classes. I still welcome you, and I welcome your pushback and debate, but I'm not going to refrain from saying what I really believe. I feel I have a responsibility as a constitutional law professor to talk about the profound challenges to the American Constitution. So you'll see a variety of approaches.
Right, great, thank you. May I say, I remember Professor Kagan, who used to be the Dean of Harvard Law School, and now she's one of the justices of the Supreme Court, once said that Harvard Law School is a New York of law schools in terms of having such variety in terms of faculty and students. But there must be some members of the faculty who would probably support what the current administration is doing.
So I think we're a big and diverse faculty, and I think, my own view, again, just speaking, all this is just speaking about myself as an individual, not representing the, I've been vice dean forever, and will stop being vice dean this June 30th. I can't wait. I've enjoyed it, but just to have that weight off my shoulders, being responsible for our graduate program and all our international endeavors. So I have a wonderful successor, and we had planned this long before COVID-19. Damian, we planned it actually over a year ago. So I'm just speaking individually. There are some faculty who I think have a different view than I've just articulated about the Trump administration. I don't think it's a large number. And there certainly are faculty who have different views on some of the more contentious issues in American society. Issues of abortion, for example. I personally think diversity in all its forms is really important to the academic enterprise. I like being challenged by my friends who have quite different views than I do. I think my writing and teaching get better if people push back and we don't all share the same assumptions. I do think in this country, I don't know how it is in the UK, it's just getting harder and harder to, things are getting so much more polarized. It's getting harder and harder to have sort of bridging conversations. For me, that's very important. But I just think it's getting harder. So it maybe makes it more important to keep up the effort.
Right, absolutely. And I'm amazed. I had no idea you are vice dean till the end of this month. This is
18 years. Yes, it's a long time, Damien. Yeah, I had not intended 18 years. I went into Dean Kagan at the end of 5 years as vice dean and said, so Elena, I haven't screwed up too badly. Maybe I should step down before I do. And she, for a variety of reasons, she insisted I keep doing it. And here I am. 18 years, yeah. So we have Professor Mark Wu, who is really wonderful, will become the vice dean. He'll do a great job. And I will get to do a little more teaching and writing, which I'm very excited about.
Right. Well, that's amazing. Mark Wu is wonderful. But I have to tell you that I do remember the day when I congratulated you when you became the vice dean.
That shows your age, down here.
Yes. So I was there 18 years ago doing my master's. And you say, oh, I'm just going to have more work. So I just remember that day, very, very vividly.
What did I say back to you?
You said, oh, I'm just going to have much more work.
That was true. It's nonstop. Our dean has said to me sometimes, he and I are good friends, our current dean, he says if you have your own law school within a law school, since we, anyway, it's just good to I feel pleased, and I'll still be helping behind the scenes a lot with Professor Wu because it's such a difficult year. You know, we're going to be online in the fall, as I said, and that has implications for students living far away in other time zones and how you structure classes to accommodate as many students as possible, and many other implications. The law school has started a fund to equip students who don't have the right equipment or good Wi-Fi to make it possible for them to do it. And although Harvard has a historically large endowment, the university's lost a vast amount of money. So this is a wonderful thing. Many faculty, including myself, have voluntarily taken a wage reduction for the next year. Here it's just incredible. I know the UK has suffered enormously too. Talking about comparative issues, I mean, look at Korea, look at Taiwan, relatively speaking, look at Germany. You know, there are clearly ways in which societies have addressed these issues more effectively, I think, than the US and UK. One of my former doctoral students who is in China asked me about teaching a class together about responses to COVID-19 in China and the US. And I said, oh, this is so depressing. I don't think I could do that. But if we did something, we would want to broaden it out and include, again, some of the more positive examples that would suggest ways, while respecting civil liberties, to still have a more effective outcome than we've had in this country.
Right, absolutely. First of all, I mean, you have been just absolutely an amazing Vice Dean. So, you know, this is just something all of us know, and, you know, thank you for everything you've done for all the SJDs. But really sincerely, but on the divisiveness, I mean, Brexit obviously has divided the UK, and it's been, I think some of the developments are very similar to what's going on in the United States. Now, a friend of mine from Oxford, a good friend of mine, really terrible with names, has written a fantastic book on this and how to talk on Brexit. I'm going to forward it to you and to everyone else.
Yeah, great. Send the title, please.
Yeah, I just, so I was at her, I just cannot remember her name now. She's Greek, fantastic person. I will share that book with everyone. But I also wanted to say, does anyone else want to ask any further questions?
I'd love if any students have questions. I'd certainly welcome them.
I think Anna's has her hand up.
Okay.
Just before you go into question mode, Damien,
Sure,
I wanted to apologise to Professor Alford for being so late, which is not a very British thing to do, but my previous meeting on equality and diversity overran. I just wanted to say a huge thank you on behalf of the university for you joining us today and ending what I understand to have been an amazing 2 days that Damien and the team have organised. And we hope to welcome you to the UK now that you're going to have a little bit more time on your hands as stepping down as Vice Dean. So whenever you're free and we have our borders open, you are more than welcome to join us. But a huge thank you from me.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for coming. And it is indeed a very impressive program that Damien's put together. He shared with me the 2-day agenda. So kudos to you for doing that.
Thank you so much, Professor Alford. I should mention Alice and Bill, who also put this together. So thank you to everyone.
You clearly taught him well.
I think we're just fortunate to have such amazing students. Teaching is such a joy.
Thank you.
I'm going to have to apologize again because I have to go off to another meeting now, but thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of the session. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Anna.
So any other students or any student actually wants to ask a question? or anyone from our faculty, anyone else?
Yeah, don't be shy if you, I know you've had a long day, but please, anything that you'd like.
If I may have another question, this is recycling a question that came up yesterday when we were discussing doctoral studies with Dan Amon and Andrew Clapham in Geneva.
Mm-hmm.
And it was about originality. So one of the things we have written down in stone here is that your doctoral thesis must make an original contribution to knowledge. And of course, originality can come from a whole number of different ways. Conceptual, through empirical, through field work type research and so on. So I wonder if you have the same thing written in stone, and if so, if you could just reflect a little on how to achieve originality through doctoral studies.
Yeah, so thank you, a terrific question. So yes, we have the same expectation that the work be truly original, and as you say that could take several forms, right? It could be a historical paper that's largely archival, or a legal sociological project that's it's kind of what they call thick description, or it could be something highly conceptual, but that's central. That's the sine qua non, must meet that standard. And I think that's part of what makes doctoral work hard, because you're ultimately, we try to help people get to that through these, as I mentioned earlier, these fields, each person doing 3 or 4 fields of their composition, where they in effect do individual tutorials with faculty over the course of at least a year. And so you read important background work, you get tested one-on-one, much harder than a written test on it. What else? In our application, how a student has performed typically in the master's program at Harvard is an important standard, but for me, the proposal they write is also extremely important when they're applying. So we don't expect them to have the fully developed original idea at the time of application. As we say, if they had it then they probably didn't need to do the doctorate, but at least some understanding of the state of play in an area of academic literature, and what might constitute a reasonable intervention in that literature. So it's beginning to get people ready for staking out originality. One other thing I might mention that's almost a preliminary to some of this is when our new master's students come, we spend an inordinate amount of time talking to them about proper citation in legal work. And invariably, we're I think American law schools, and maybe our school in particular, very, very demanding about citation in ways that seem, I think, frankly, bizarre to people, not only from law schools abroad, but probably even in other fields in the United States. So there's the parody issue of the Harvard Law Review that it's a parody, a joke. It starts with, the page starts with one line. It says the United States of America, and then it has a footnote to each word. You know, what's the derivation of the word the? When was it first used? United. And so, you know, it's sort of a joke of how compulsive academic lawyers in the US can be. But we want students, even from the beginning, to be thinking about the idea you express in your paper, how much of it is truly only yours and how much is derived from other people. And even if you've done a lot of reading and things are mixed together and language is yours, still to the extent that it builds importantly on the work of others, how do you attribute that? So it's sort of cultivating the habits of mind. But law schools really are different than, you know, my friends in some other departments just don't have to be quite as compulsive about footnote. When I write articles for non-law publications, invariably I will get back from the readers in the submission process well, this looks interesting, but there's way too many footnotes, or, you know, everybody knows that. Why does there have to be a citation, or why is there extensive commentary in a footnote? You should just mention the title of the author and publication and leave it at that. So we have, for good or ill, a certain approach in law schools.
Right. And Professor Alford, may I ask you at the very beginning, I understood you said you had the selection of the latest cohort of the SJDs recently, and that you're discussing the topics, sort of so were you aiming at particular topics that the SJDs would address in their dissertation? Did I understand that correctly at the beginning?
No, there's no, it's more that we probably spend somewhere, there are several criteria of academic record so far. You know, how did they do in the master's at Harvard? What have they done before they came to Harvard? References from their faculty mentors who will be supervising them in the doctorate. How enthusiastic are the faculty? Frankly, how generous have been those faculty supervisors in the past? Have they really put time into nurturing their doctoral students? But the proposals vary enormously in the fields and their approaches to law. And that's actually to be desired, going back to what I said before about diversity. So we're not looking for any particular topic. One does see over time certain trends. So this year, there are no surprise for several about artificial intelligence, although they tended to have very different approaches about artificial intelligence, several to do with issues of gender, but we don't look for particular topics as such.
Sure.
I think Itaf has her hand up.
Please.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it's indeed a very interesting presentation. Thank you so much, Professor Alford, and it's really I mean, gives us the opportunity to think about several questions and challenges while listening to you presenting. My name is Itaf Al-Awabdi. I'm from Jordan, and I'm PhD candidate, and my thesis is about the right to education. Specifically, my focus is on the access and quality of education to be provided for children, all children, then in specific those who are most vulnerable, the refugee children, or children caught in crisis, actually. And now, actually, it's very much the current situation with COVID-19 and children not going to school. Many they are, I mean, locked down at homes, and many of them, they don't have access to education. It seems very much relevant to the current situation. Nevertheless, my question to you is far beyond the, I mean, children's right to access to education, which is more about like very, very basic. I mean, as children grow basically into being an adult, basically the question would be about their right to attend higher education. From your perspective, how do you see, for example, I mean, a very specific example for Harvard Law School, how like race and gender, class, and I mean, deprivation and vulnerability play a role when it comes to admission to the school, in addition to the financial resources, how that all play together for admission to higher education, and how would you perceive these different factors that would affect equality and quality as well, speaking about diversity and equality at large?
Wow, this is great. So first of all, congratulations on your topic. It's incredibly important. And I think, as you noted, COVID-19 is, it's in this country, and I assume that it's true elsewhere, it's just staggering what the implications will be and how all the inequalities that previously existed are increased, are exacerbated by this. So, you know, kids who are from privileged backgrounds can sit in front of a computer at home, and you know, more typically in the United States, have parents who are able to work from home, so they can help the child during the days of sitting there in front of a screen, and people who don't have the equipment, they can't afford it, or don't have Wi-Fi in the same quality, or whose parents need to be out of the house to work, to bring home a paycheck to pay for shelter and food, left further behind. So I just think this crisis exacerbates all the terrible inequalities probably in every society. And your point about higher education, your question about higher education, yeah, I think that's been an issue as you probably know, in the United States. There's a lawsuit against Harvard recently about admissions it was to Harvard College, not to the law school, the undergraduate school, but to do with preferences. And in the American system, there are a host of different kinds of preferences that are given. Again, I myself, personally, not speaking institutionally, think that intellectual diversity, demographic diversity, gender diversity, other kinds of diversity enrich the experience for everyone and for the institution. And there's a social justice dimension where, at least in this society, the role that universities, and particularly elite universities, play in providing access to privilege in the future is enormous. And so it's really incumbent for them to provide access to a broad range of people. So Damien was being very sweet before and mentioning something about my 18 years as Vice-Dean. The one thing I'm proudest of by far is that we've had a need-blind admissions policy. And that is, we've taken in our master's program, which is in doctoral programs, the ones I oversee, students irrespective of class, gender, anything else, and financial need. And we've provided grants or loans or some combination to enable people to attend. And so there are not a lot of American law schools that are able to do that. Now, some people say, well, gee, if you're sitting at Harvard or Yale, you start with a lot of funding to begin with. And that is true, but I would say I've spent thousands of hours over the last 18 years to continue to enable us to do that. So I think the legitimacy of academic institutions, and particularly ones like my own, really hinges importantly on ensuring access to talented people. And I think talent just comes in all types of, I don't think I know is a deeply held certainty in a world where there aren't too many certainties, that talent comes in all forms, shapes, sizes, backgrounds. So I think it's incredibly important. But I do think your question, Itaf, is it's gonna be harder in the future, I suspect, because going back to the first thing I was saying, people who already start with some economic disadvantages, those are exacerbated. And so, how do you make up for that? How do you measure their innate talent if they haven't had as much opportunity to develop that talent? Universities are going to have less resources going forward. It's not just this university, I think probably everywhere. So those are tough issues that I think anybody who's in a responsible position in university administration has to be thinking about. In the United States, so how do we support universities? Well, it's 3 or 4 things. It's private philanthropy. Well, that's going to dry up some because people have less disposable income, and there are such dire needs of mere survival for many people. And second source, tuition dollars. Well, those are going to be tighter, obviously, and financial need greater. And then third, state support. Even the private universities in the United States get considerable support from the federal government, just as public universities in the United States get considerable support from the private sector. So all these sources of revenue are going to be tighter. Maybe doing more online enables universities to reach other audiences, most importantly in a substantive way. I've been struck now that I'm teaching online that maybe for people who, because of a physical disability or home responsibilities, can't get out, maybe they have more access when things are online. On the other hand, you know, as we said, there's some drawbacks to being online, but your questions are incredibly important. It's great that you're working on access for children who are displaced, children who are refugees.
Fabulous. Professor Alford, are you available to take a couple of more questions?
Damien, take one or two more, and then I should probably break because soon I have more internal Zoom meetings. My life is Zoom meetings these days.
We understand, absolutely. I think it's everyone's, and thank you so much for taking really the time to talk to us. I think we could talk for hours. Obviously, I'm not sure whether it was Francesca or Khan who raised their, was it Francesca first?
No, please.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And I'm Francesca, I'm from Italy. And in the past, I worked for UN in Cambodia, extraordinary chambers in the court of Cambodia and UN Women in Bangkok. And then I completed my LLM at Fordham University in New York.
Good.
2018. But my question for you is, because I'm a PhD candidate and my thesis is about gender and international criminal law, and also I'm focusing on LGBT people. Sometimes when I was in New York at the UN, but also application form for university, they ask in the application form the gender, and they just put two boxes, male and female, and that's it. So some people think that is a kind of form of discrimination. And I would like to ask you, what do you think? Is it better to remove gender, especially because sometimes at the UN, there are transgender people that put male, but when they have an interview, they are women. So there is this kind of misunderstanding, and especially UN Globe, that is an organization that is not part of the UN, but take care of LGBT people that are staff member at the UN. They think that is great or better to remove from the application form for UN jobs the term gender and don't ask anything. So my question for you is a kind of form of discrimination or not really? It's just a kind of form of criticism.
So thank you. Thanks. Another good question. So I think if that question is asked in a binary way, you know, it doesn't capture the complexity of human experience. So I think, you know, asking male or female is not the right way to ask it. Ideally, you know, you create, it'd be a better and more useful question if it envisioned a much broader range of possibility. It would also be like in the United States, on some applications, there's questions about race. And it, you know, race is in some ways a social construct, right? So, you know, if you, so my wife is Chinese, and so my children sometimes say to me, they're adults now, but they sometimes say, like, we don't see ourselves in this box, right? We don't, the choices don't include us. You know, you know, you're Caucasian or you're African American or you're Asian American, and they say, you know, we're like multiple. We don't fit into any one box. So I do think it's good to ask the information, and give you the reason in a moment, but it has to be asked in a way that isn't artificially restrictive. So why is it good? I think it's, again, speaking only for myself, I think it's good because, going back to Etaf's question and access to universities, if one didn't know, you know, let's talk about the United States, where there historically was a lot of discrimination, still is, obviously, regarding racial and ethnic minorities, and particularly African Americans. So if you didn't know if somebody was a member of a particular minority group in some way or other, you might not be able to make the effort to be sure they're included. And that's, you know, this is obviously a very contentious and fraught issue in the United States. was centered around that, with the plaintiffs arguing that Harvard basically should not have taken race into account in its undergraduate admissions. You know, part of the irony in that case was, as with all American universities, except I think for Caltech, maybe MIT, children of alumni sometimes will get preferences. So not a huge preference, but you know, other things being equal, if Damian and Bill are comparable applicants, and Damian's mother went to Yale, and you know, Yale might give a slight tilt at the end. So I, you know, that some people could, that's not unassailable. People might say that's wrong. It privileges people who are already privileged. But I think at least where American society is now having more information, assuming people of good intention making the decisions and some checks and balances to make sure that they don't use the information in an improper way, is better than not having the information. But it has to be nuanced. Going back to your question, you know, male or female just doesn't capture the world, you know, Asian American or Native, the world we live in.
Fantastic. Thank you. Would you be able to take one maybe last question?
Thanks, Jamie. I'll do one last one. Right. Okay.
Zani, do you also, actually we have two in line. Was it Khan first, or probably one last question?
Well, why don't we'll take these two, and then I really need to take off.
Two together. Thank you so much. You're so gracious, Professor Alford. That's really, really kind. So very briefly, Khan and Zanic, please be very brief, okay? As much as you can. Go ahead.
All right. Hello, Professor. My name is Khan. It's basically my third year as a doctoral student. My research is on the critical defamation. The criminal defamation of heads of state, and I'm also quite involved in comparative law, particularly comparative criminal law. Hence, my question, quite briefly, is related to aspects of comparative law. Since, as we are all experiencing in an immediate manner the same deadly issue, that is COVID-19. Do you think that in the short run there will be, comparative law maybe may become more appealing from a utilitarian point of view, because when you're dealing with the comparative law, you also have to it's always good to have have a certain grasp of several languages, etc. So I was wondering whether whether you think that our field may become something bigger in the following months. That's my question.
Thank you, Khan. Should I answer, Damian?
Go ahead if you wish.
Good question. Yes, I think you're onto something, and so there have been a lot of facile comparisons with respect to COVID-19 so far, and I do think it illustrates the possibility of comparison in a more serious way. Illustrates one of the many values of comparative law. I want to teach my students, I say we're going to learn about China, and that's valuable, but we're also going to learn a lot about ourselves, because how can you understand what's singular or not about your own law, your own culture, your own society, unless you have looked at another one? So I think you're right, it will do more. In the US, comparative law always has been a bit of a underappreciated field, and some of that goes back to this notion of so-called American exceptionalism. I think all great powers, when they're at their apogee, think that they're exceptional, but in this case of the United States, because we're the first country organized around a written constitution, and because we're continent-like in our size and sort of two big oceans keeping us physically isolated, it's grown even more. So historically, I think comparative law was sort of underappreciated, but I think it's getting to be more appreciated. And you're absolutely right, Khan. I think the COVID-19, the appallingly bad response of the United States will awaken more interest in people understanding more about other societies. I mean, just even to the north, Canada, or it's just done vastly better than we have done on this.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic, thank you. And our last question. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for this meeting, Damian and Professor. My question is, I'm Zanic and I'm a PhD student doing research on human rights in Tunisia. My question is, I know that America has a long history of activism, social activism, human rights activism, and advocacy in the past. And that was a very tight relation between academic and activist. My question is regarding to the current situation and all of that, how much you think that there is still kind of a tight relation between activist and academic? Either some of the academic consider themselves as an activist in the United States or vice versa. Thank you so much.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Well, let me think about this for a second here. These are great questions your students are asking, Damian. So I would say if I look at our faculty, there are some people who, I think everyone sees themselves as an academic, but some people feel that an important part of their professional life and identity is as an activist as well, not in lieu, but as well. We have several really top flight clinicians who spend their time teaching students about the practice of law, refugee law, with a wonderful refugee clinic, prison law. So people see themselves that way. For myself, I always feel, frankly, some tension. I engage in some activity that might be described as activist, but I do want my classroom to be one where students can voice opinions that would disagree with things I've written or said or done. And I really work hard to make that possible. In our class discussion, I sometimes will jump in on the side that I actually don't normatively support myself, is I see the students advancing that position are outnumbered. Not on everyone, there are a few things that people will say or do that I wouldn't want to be associated with, but often we'll jump in. So I think it's a hard balance, I think, to navigate. And then I think, Damian, I don't know if this is the case in the UK. In the US, I would predict that one consequence of the current focus around racial justice and COVID-19 is more pressure on professors who, there's been a lot of letters, like in our faculty, I signed, I was one of the first signers of a letter of 65 of us wrote about what the George Floyd murder illustrates. But I would think if I were more of an activist, if I were a student activist or an activist outside, I would be pressing professors who write letters to actually do more. Letters are great, thoughts and prayers. Every time there's a shooting in the United States in a school or a nightclub, the politicians always say, some politicians, our thoughts and prayers are with you. I would think if I were a younger person, I would be saying, that's great, but what are you actually going to do concretely? And so I hope in our conversations here in our faculty, it will be a subset of the whole faculty, but hopefully we actually get beyond just a nice letter and try to focus a little more on, what's next. Anyway, it's been fun to talk with you all, and feel free to stay in touch. Damian can give you my email address, and I'm happy to answer further questions. And again, you're lucky to be in his good hands. So thanks a lot for inviting me.
Thank you, Professor Alford. You've given us so much food for thought. Thank you for talking to our students. It's been just absolutely amazing. Thank you for everyone who asked questions. Alice for organizing this. So a big thank you, Professor Alford. We'll be in touch. You heard the Professor Vice Chancellor's invitation as well.
And we can travel. I was supposed to make a trip to the UK this coming academic year for some inaugural lecture somewhere at the University of Durham, but I don't think we're going to be traveling. Our university has forbidden us for the time being to travel internationally on anything that relates to university business or involves any university expenditure. So a totally personal trip one could do, although those are also very strongly discouraged, but any kind of university business, and so they're really serious about that. So because they're so worried that people will travel, come back, bring with them. Although, as several of my international students have said, their parents are worried about staying in this country as opposed to going home to Korea or Singapore or wherever. So let's hope we're all in good health. Yeah. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Alford. Always welcome. Keep us in mind and we'll be in touch. A big thank you to you and your family, and give my best to your family. I remember Benji. I'm sure he doesn't want to be called this way now, but I remember 18 years ago, you called him Benji. He was a little boy running around. So
thank you. Now he's a graduate student. But thank you. Thank you, Eva.
Thank you, David.
Have a great weekend. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.